If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I help writers find solutions to their story problems so that they can finish their novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
On today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 14 and discuss what we've learned about the core event and progressive complications. And we'd really love it if you could give our show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. All right, Valerie, why don't you start us off this episode by telling us what your big aha moments were with respect to the core event?
Alrighty. Well, my study topic this season really drove home the importance of the core event. I mean, I knew it going into it, but when I took the time to actually focus on it in every single episode, wow, I knew it was important, but it's even more important than I thought it was. It is the climax of the whole story. It is the moment that your reader is waiting for, and it has got to be good. What we're doing when we're writing a novel or a screenplay is saying to our audience, I'm going to tell you a story about this character who wants to achieve this specific thing. And by the end, you will know whether she succeeded or not. I mean, that's it in a very simplistic form. So the core event, or the climax of the story, is directly connected to the protagonist, the object of desire, and the central dramatic question. We got to be super clear about what these things are, because if we're not, the core event is not going to be as strong as it needs to be. So I want to give you a real life example just to drive home the point here. Because in every episode this season, I gave you all kinds of examples, but let me give you one from real life so that you can see why this is the way it is in a story. I just got back from England, and I was in London with my sister because she ran the London Marathon. So in this story that I'm going to tell you, my sister is the protagonist. Her object of desire is to run the London Marathon. And by run the London Marathon, I mean finish the London Marathon. So the central dramatic question then is, will she finish the marathon? If I were to write this as a novel or a screenplay, the story itself, the meat of the story, would be all about my sister's journey to the marathon, journey to the finish line. Now, she made the decision to do this marathon 2 years ago. So for 2 years, she trained. She trained hard. She was running very early in the morning in the cold and the snow and the rain and the wind, and sometimes in the heat and the humidity. She was lifting weights. She invested in coaches and physiotherapists and massage therapists and nutritionists. She studied running form and technique. She learned about different types of equipment. She experimented with all the supplements and all the different gear, the different types of running sneakers, some of which are incredibly expensive, let me tell you. The list goes on and on and on and on. It was 2 full years with a whole lot of work, a significant investment of time and money and effort and energy. And there were some ups and there were some downs. It wasn't a smooth path by any stretch of the imagination. And all of that was leading up to race day. And throughout the 2 years, friends and family who knew that she was training would say, how's your training going? Are you having a good day? Having a bad day? Because we all understood that she had a goal of finishing the marathon. Her object of desire was to finish the marathon. We had that question planted in our mind of, is she going to do it? So we were curious and we wanted to know, we wanted to get updates. We wanted to follow her story because we were very clear about what she wanted to do. So the core event of that story then is the marathon itself. If you are writing this as a story, a big portion of the end of your story, right in that last act, maybe even the entire act, would be the run itself. If you think about Rocky, the entire last act is the match with Apollo Creed. So what I'm saying here is the reader of that kind of a story, if this was, a fictional novel or a screenplay, they want to follow the character through the race. The reader wants to hear the roar of the crowd and feel the blazing hot sun down on the character. They want to feel the muscle soreness, stiffness, all that kind of stuff. They want to, if your character is thirsty, the reader wants to feel that thirst. The reader wants to experience doubt about whether they'll make it, if that is what your character is feeling. Especially if you throw in some complications, and Melanie talked about progressive complications this season. Well, a progressive complication in that situation in the race would be other runners around your protagonist falling over. And that happens. I was at the 30K mark, which is between 18 and 19 miles, waiting for my sister to cheer her on. And there was a lot of paramedics there for a reason, because a lot of people were conking out at 30K, either voluntarily going over to the paramedics and saying, I'm out, I need help, or they would all of a sudden just fall over. If you've never watched a marathon or a race in person, it is something to behold, because people's legs are just like rubber and they are so determined to keep running, and eventually their body just gives out and they collapse. It would have been scarier for me if there wasn't all these paramedics around. So that's a great progressive complication, right? To wonder whether your character is going to make it over the finish line. And when the character gets to the finish line, that is the catharsis that the core event brings. When your character crosses the finish line and the ribbon is across their chest and they break through the ribbon and they get that medal put around their neck, when your character does it, the reader feels, they could have done it too. And they feel like they kind of have done it. They get that runner's high, even though they haven't done any of the running, because they've been living vicariously through your character. Okay, so imagine now if in this fictional story, imagine if the story stopped, like if the book was over when the character arrived at the airport to leave for London. There's no race. There is no even London. The story ends when the character is dropped off at the airport. You'd say, well, hang on, I've been reading this whole book for 350 pages to see this character run the marathon. What the heck? Or imagine if the story took the character to London, but then the story kind of got distracted and focused on all the touristy things that your main character did. The trip to Windsor, the trip to the Tower of London, the trip to Covent Garden and all the great shops that were there and the buskers and all the wonderful things that there are to see in London. And finished there instead of taking the reader to the marathon. Right? You as the reader, you'd cry foul pretty quickly. You'd flick that book across the room because it would be a stupid story. I mean, it would be. Now, my friends who don't even know my sister have been hearing me talk about this for 2 years, and they knew I was going with her to cheer her on. On race day, when we got back to the hotel, because during the race, my phone wouldn't work. There were so many people on the streets that, you just lost cell service, right? You forget it. Your phone was a completely useless piece of equipment. When we got back to the hotel and I checked my messages, I had so many messages from my friends who have never even met my sister because they were so invested in her journey. And they too had that central dramatic question in their minds of, is she going to finish the run? Will she make it? They were checking the forecast and they knew that race day was very hot, very humid, right? Another progressive complication for the race day. But that's how compelling a central dramatic question is. And that's posed at the beginning of your story, and it's tied into the main character and her object of desire. The core event then that comes at the end of your story is the answer to that question. And your reader is going to stay with your story because they really want to know how it turned out. So fictional stories work exactly the same way as this real life example I gave you, right? Like I said, at the beginning, we introduce the character and we clearly explain to the reader that this character wants something specific. The reader then is wondering, will the character accomplish it? And they're going to stay with the whole book to find out the answer. The answer is given in the core event, which is also the climax of the story. Seriously, it is that simple. It really is. Everything in your story is building up to this final moment, to this climax. And remember, the type of core event that you create for your character and for your reader is going to depend on the genre that you're writing in. So the example I gave you with my sister running the marathon, that is called a sports performance story. So the core event is the sporting event, right? Like with Rocky, it's the boxing match. In Eddie the Eagle, it's the Olympic ski jump event. For my sister, it was the actual marathon. Every genre has its own specific type of core event. So you really have to study a lot of examples of the type of story that you're writing in order to understand what kind of core event you need to create for your story, for your reader, to deliver the promise of your story. And that's kind of another way of thinking about it, actually. The core event delivers on the promise of your story, right? That's the climax of your whole novel. If you miss the mark, I really want you to pay attention here. If you miss the mark, like the movie Shirley did, and that was the episode we did, episode 1405, the 5th episode of this season, your story is going to be a disappointment to your reader. It just will. And I feel quite confident in saying that you do not want to invest several years of your life writing a novel that will ultimately disappoint your reader. I can't imagine that anyone listening to this right now is like, sure, that sounds like a great idea. I'll spend 5 years slaving away over this book and then at the end have my readers say, this is the stupidest book I ever read. Sure, that sounds like a good time to me. No. So listen, if you have not yet had a chance to listen to the episodes in season 14 yet, go through them and watch the movies. Seriously, take the time to watch the movies. Because what Melanie and I have to say about our study topic this season and in all the seasons, you're going to learn a lot more if you have seen the movie. All right. That's enough out of me. Melanie, what did you take away this season about the core event?
Well, I'm very much aligned with you about the core event. And I don't think we can emphasize right enough that the core event is the biggest scene in your novel and that it should be the most impactful scene as well. Now, I think we had a mixed bag of core event scenes this season. And so what that meant is that when a core event scene didn't work, we could really see why it wasn't working. And most of the time it was due to a breakdown in the through line between the inciting incident and the core event. Now, this was really evident in Anyone But You and Shirley, like Valerie mentioned. Now, in Anyone But You, the problem was everything in between the meet cute, so the inciting incident, and the commitment core event scene. So everything in between that was pretty stupid. And if you listen to this season's What Went Wrong episode, which is coming up, you'll hear it. You'll hear us talk about that and you'll see it happen again. So there's a bit of a teaser for you. And in Shirley, the protagonist's object of desire changed from the beginning of the story through to the core event. And that meant that it became ambiguous. And so that meant the core event didn't really align with the object of desire or the inciting incident. So it really missed the mark, and it didn't provide the catharsis that we were expecting in that story. So in summary, like, this season really confirmed the importance of understanding the core event and how to get from the beginning to the end so that that gives readers the release and the satisfaction that we want them to have.
Well said. Well said. All right. So here is the main thing that I want you to take away. I've already said it. I'm going to say it again because it's that important. The core event is a big deal. It is a very, 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 very big deal. It's probably going to be the biggest scene in your whole story, or the biggest portion of your whole story, because you may write the core event over a number of scenes. Your reader is waiting for this moment. It might take them a month or two to actually read your book. So they are waiting for this moment for a month or two. They are reading this entire book to get to this moment. So you got to make it worth their while. If your core event is a flop, it really doesn't matter how good the rest of the book is. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. Your reader is not going to remember any of those previous good bits. They'll only remember the disappointing end. And that means their opinion of your book as a whole will be that it's not a very good book. They certainly will not proactively recommend it for friends. They won't buy it as a gift for Christmas or birthdays. And if someone should ask their opinion, like, oh, did you read this book? What did you think of it? They're not going to give it a recommendation, all because the core event failed. And this is something, if you don't follow Seth Godin, this is true of any experience. And Seth talks about this somewhere along the line. I don't know if it was a podcast episode or one of his books. I can't remember. He uses the example of a restaurant. If you, as the patron of a restaurant, had a lovely meal, but on the way out, the maitre d' threw your coat at you and pushed you out the door, all you're going to tell people is that you weren't treated very well, that you were shoved out the door and, and kicked on your way out, or you were rushed out before you really wanted to go, or the maitre d' was rude. We remember the last interaction that we had with a good or a service. So your reader's going to remember the last part, the last touch point in your novel, which is the core event. So if it doesn't satisfy, that's what they'll remember. And they therefore will, their memory of your entire book is that it was as disappointing as that end. Yeah. So there's a lot riding on your core event. So bottom line here, make it really, 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 really good. No pressure though. All right, Melanie, this season, I'm just full of good news and good times, aren't I? All right, Melanie, this season you studied progressive complications. So what did you discover?
All right. Well, progressive complications are a play between the two possible outcomes throughout the story. So the two possible outcomes depend upon the specific wants and needs of the protagonist and antagonist, and also what's at stake. What the antagonist wants is equally as important as what the protagonist wants, because it's the forces of antagonism that helps writers determine how the progressive complications appear right through to the climactic moment, which is what Valerie is talking about. So it's interesting how this nested this season. But the forces of antagonism create the progressive complications for the protagonist, because what the forces of antagonism want is usually the opposite of what the protagonists want. Now, In line with understanding how the antagonist shapes the progressive complications, I still like Janet Burroway's description of progressive complications from her book Writing Fiction. And in it, she says, and I quote, "Each antagonist must have sufficient power that the reader is left in no doubt about the outcome. But the antagonist must represent a real and potent danger, and the pattern of the story's complications will be achieved by shifting the power back and forth from one antagonist to the other. And finally, an action will occur that will shift the power irreversibly in one direction." End quote. And that's from page 131 of her book. Now, thinking about the progressive complications as a shift in power towards the forces of antagonism is helpful because it starts to focus writers on the actions and motivations of the protagonists and the forces of antagonism. And Robert McKee addresses this in his book Action. And to paraphrase him, he basically says, "The protagonist is motivated to take action that will create a positive outcome for themselves. However, there is a difference between what she thought would happen and what actually happens. And what actually happens moves her further away from her goal. So the subsequent reaction that she has creates an even greater gap between what she wants and where she is. And this pattern continues until the protagonist is forced to make an irreversible decision." Now, progressive complications don't have to involve seismic shifts or big actions. They can be subtle and create uncertainty. And if you remember last season, when I studied tension, uncertainty is tension's best friend. Now, the power of the antagonist to make life difficult for your protagonist is key to creating compounding progressive complications. These little packets of fun are essential units of storytelling because they move the story forward. And eventually, like we mentioned, and like Valerie reinstated just before, they lead to the climactic moment or the core event. Now, the importance of progressive complications can't be overstated, in my opinion. So, Valerie, what were your aha moments for progressive complications this season?
Well, I really love that that was your study topic for the season. I mean, we could write a whole book on progressive complications, and maybe one of these days we will. You never know. See what I can rope you into. And the reason I'm saying that is because, like you just said, Melanie, the importance of progressive complications cannot be overstated. Yet, hardly anyone is talking about it. Progressive complications are the basis of the entire middle of your story. So at least 50% of your book absolutely relies on you knowing what they are and how to use them. I kind of think of them as the engine that propels your story forward, that moves your story along. So, I mean, and they always work a little bit differently. That's why we've got to study stories. That's why we've got to read widely, deeply, actively, and consistently, because there's no blueprint here. There's no step-by-step instructions. There's no template we can give you that you just fill in the lines, and presto magico, you've got a bunch of complications that will automatically work because they're highly nuanced, right? For example, in episode 1407, The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, we saw how it worked there with a multi-plot story. And that's very different than a story with a single protagonist. And it's very different in one genre versus another genre. And something else that I really liked that you did this season, because it's such a big topic, I did wonder how you were going to tackle it, to be perfectly honest. But something that you really highlighted for our listeners, which I love, is that you looked at progressive complications at the macro level and the micro level. So by that, I mean, for example, in Anyone But You, which was episode 1402, the second episode of this season, you really looked at the scene level, progressive complications in the scene level. That's the micro level. Probably because that story is so awful, there was only one scene that you could possibly say anything about. I see the method to your madness here, Melanie. But then you contrasted that in the very next episode of the season, 1403, episode 1403, which is Green Book, where you looked at the macro story level a view, so progressive complications at a high level. This is infinitely fascinating to me. So if you are writing your novel or your screenplay or your memoir, whatever it is you're working on, and you're somewhere in the middle of your story, and you find your story wandering, or you find yourself thinking, well, now what do I write? Like, how do I fill up 80 or 90,000 words? How do I know if this story is actually something that someone wants to read? Look at the progressive complications. How are they working? Do they vary in size? Are there some big ones and some small ones? Are they complicating the plot? Are they making the life for your character more difficult? Are they sometimes getting her closer to her object of desire and sometimes pulling her further away from it? This is the importance of progressive complications. So again, if you have not had time to listen to all the episodes this season, or if you haven't yet had a chance to watch the movies, please do so, because just like core event, progressive complications is a super important topic, and it'll really help you to get a better handle on it. All right, Melanie, in saying all that, what is the key thing you want people to take away about from the season about progressive complications?
Well, the most important takeaway is that progressive complications are a dance between the two possible outcomes for your protagonist. You, as the writer, must know what the protagonist wants and what's at stake if they don't get it. Then you have to make the protagonist's action reflect her desire to get what she wants, while making sure most things that happen in response to her actions shift her away from the desired outcome until the end. And if you have clarity around the want and the stakes, then creating progressive complications is easier. But you also have to make sure that the reader understands what the want is and what the stakes are.
Hear, hear. All right. Well, that's the end of the regular season episodes. So
Woohoo!
the next 2 weeks, we've got our special episodes, What Went Wrong and What Went Right. But after that, we'll be into season 15. Season 15. Can you believe it?
No.
What? Yeah. Listen, I hear you, sister. So listen, do you have your study topic yet for season 15? And if so, what is it?
I do. And I mentioned at the beginning of this season that progressive complications compound and build to a point where the character is forced to make an irreversible decision. And that irreversible decision is called a turning point. So next season, I'm going to be studying turning points. What about you?
Awesome. I love turning points. It's a love-hate relationship, but I mostly love them. All right. So next season, in season 15, I am studying something called the villain's monologue. I love these things. These are a hoot and a half. Now, please don't at me with your comments about villains and you don't have a villain in your story. I'm using villain generically to mean the antagonist or forces of antagonism. But, the force or forces of antagonism monologue is a bit of a mouthful. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite so easily. So I'm just going to keep calling it the villain's monologue and trust that you are all intelligent enough to fill in the blank with whatever kind of force of antagonism that you are using in your story. This is a really interesting one. And I promise you, once you see it, you will never unsee it. It's one of those, you'll wonder how come you never noticed it before.
Absolutely.
Fun.
Absolutely. And like most of the stuff that we study, right, some of these things are a bit underrated or a bit like they sort of sit underneath the really obvious things. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to next season. I think it'll be really good, really fun, especially the villain's monologue. All right. All right, well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week for our What Went Wrong episode. And this time around, we're taking a look at Ghosted. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. And if you'd like to get my tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit me on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about me at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.